All the way from Kelowna, British Columbia, our next speaker is Brenda Davis. Brenda Davis is a registered dietitian and nutritionist. She is a leader in her field and an internationally acclaimed speaker. She has worked in public health, nutritionist, clinical and nutritional specialist. I should say worked as a public health nutritionist, clinical nutrition specialist, nutrition consultant, and academic nutrition instructor. She undertook a big diabetes study, a big intervention research project in the Marshall Islands in Mahuro, I think, if I'm saying that right, and she spent, I think, 8 months there at one point and was going back repeatedly and just had incredible results reversing diabetes through nutrition in this program. Brenda is the co-author of 7 books, bestsellers, Becoming Vegan, Becoming Vegetarian, The New Becoming Vegetarian, and Defeating Diabetes, Dairy-Free and Delicious. And then she's got a new book out, which is Becoming Raw and the Raw Food Revolution Diet. As I said, she lives in Kelowna, British Columbia with her husband, and she has 2 grown children. On a personal level, Brenda is an incredibly sweet, warm, and engaging person, and I'm really looking forward to her talk. Please welcome Brenda Davis.
Well, it really is very much a privilege to be here. And I thank Jeff and Sabrina and their whole family for putting this amazing event together. It's really just outstanding. And where should I stand? Does it matter? No. I'm just in the light. I'm going to look over a bit. So anyway, my charge this morning is to talk about the myths and realities surrounding raw food diets. And I can tell you, it's so interesting that Dr. McDougall spent a lot of time talking about the paleo diet. This, in the raw food world, is what they consider the paleo diet. You can see early vegetarians returning from the kill. And actually, a lot of raw foodists believe that the reason we should be raw is because that was the original diet before there was fire. And also that no other animals cook their food, right? So this is one of their justifications. I want to add something to what Dr. McDougall said about the paleo diet, just to give you a few more tools when you're confronted with people who are doing this diet. Number 1, it's estimated that the average fiber intake of people who are eating a paleo diet way back when, like the real paleo diet, was over 100 grams of fiber a day. How much does the average vegan eat? About 50, maybe 60. That means they were eating twice as much fiber as we are. That means they were eating a lot of plant foods. Do the people following a paleo diet today eat anywhere close to that amount of fiber? Not even close. 15, maybe 20 grams. And the second thing to think about is that the animals that they were consuming, the limited amount of animals in many cases that they were consuming, had an estimated percent fat, about 3, 5, maybe 7%. Today, our domestic animals don't even come close. They're not eating. The paleo diet today does not resemble the original paleo diet in any stretch of the imagination. So it's just really important to recognize that. And I'm so grateful that Dr. McDougall showed the quote of Dr. Cordain when he said that, we'd only be able to feed 1/10 of the world's population. If everybody ate a paleo diet, we would need 10 planet Earths to sustain our current population, which is a very, very scary thought. So I want to tell you a little bit about how I came to be talking about raw and writing books about raw foods. Because I've written about vegetarian and vegan nutrition. These are my passion. I want everybody who wants to do vegetarian and vegan to do it extraordinarily well. I want people who know you to look at you and say, I want to be like that person. Because that is what will bring people towards a more plant-centered diet. So that's what my work has been all about. And then I got into the diabetes and the diabetes research, and I'm very interested in reversing chronic disease. And then about 4 years ago, our publisher came to myself and my writing partner, Vasanto Molina, and said, would you guys like to do some stuff on raw? Because raw is hot, it's selling big time. And we looked at each other and we said, nah, I don't think so. And of course, as dietitians, when we started writing about vegetarian and vegan, we were risking our credibility in the eyes of our peers, okay? And we were paving the way, really, literally. 30 years ago, things weren't as easy as they are today. And so the thought of doing raw, that is out there in terms of dietitian world, okay? Because I'm a registered dietitian. But then we thought about it, and we thought, you know what? When we see on the cover of a newspaper, a vegan child, B12 deficient, died, parents going to jail, you know, often what we were seeing is these parents were doing raw with babies, and feeding them inappropriate milks and so on and so forth. And we thought, you know what? The raw world is part of the vegan world, and it's really important that if they're doing this, they get it right. And there was so much misinformation in that world, we thought somebody's got to try to sort the misinformation from what we know is science-based. And so we decided to go for it. The first book we did was with Sherry Soria, who's a raw food chef, and that was an experience, but we didn't agree on everything. And so our publisher said, that's okay. You guys write the science book when you're finished with that book. This was more sort of weight loss book, so we wrote Becoming Raw. And the reason it's called Becoming Raw is because we're the becoming dietitians, right? So it was part of the series. Really what it was a book to go through and assess the claims of people eating raw food and to create a pattern that would work for people who wanted to do raw. So what is raw anyway? Well, the definition is basically foods that aren't cooked, right? Anything heated above 118 degrees is considered cooked. So we're looking at things prepared using very low temperature or not cooked at all. You're considered a raw foodist if you eat 75% or more of your food by weight as raw food. If you eat 50 to 75, it's a high raw diet. And sometimes you'll hear about a living food diet, and you wonder what's the difference between raw and living food? Well, a living food diet is a raw food diet, but it just happens to be very high in enzymes, probiotics, and fermented germinated foods. There's a lot of controversy in the raw world, and there's probably no way of eating that diverges more significantly from mainstream SAD diet than a raw diet. And within the vegan world, the raw and the traditional vegans are at odds on numerous issues. But even within the raw world, you've got the 80-10-10 Doug Graham, where it's very low fat, mono foods, so you're eating, 10 bananas for breakfast and 4 heads of romaine lettuce for lunch. And then you've got the other end of the spectrum, which is very high coconut oil, very, very high avocados and so on, and olive oil poured over everything. So there's even a lot of differences within the raw world. So what we want to do here is we really want to look at what science says. And so what I've done is I've taken 5 very common raw beliefs, and we'll just take a look at what we know, what the claims are, and what we found when we looked at the science. Number 1, plant enzymes are essential to human health. Number 2, cooked foods are toxic. Number 3, we get plenty of vitamin B12 from plant foods and internal production. Number 4, legumes contain anti-nutrients and are best avoided. And number 5, raw food diets reverse chronic disease. So issue number 1, plant enzymes are essential to human health. Have you heard that before? Okay. The views on enzymes in the mainstream world and the raw food world are at two opposite ends of the spectrum. If you pick up any medical textbook or any dietetic or nutrition textbook, this is what it will tell you. It will tell you that food enzymes are completely broken down in the stomach, because what's in the stomach? Acid. What are enzymes? Protein. So protein, the enzyme proteins are just digested and absorbed as amino acids. They have absolutely no significance to human health whatsoever. So that's what you hear in mainstream. In the raw world, you basically hear that enzymes are absolutely vital to human health. We actually have a limited supply of them, and the more we can preserve the enzymes in our system, the longer we'll live, and that food enzymes contributes to digestion and enzymes in our bodies. And basically, many raw foodists believe that enzymes are the main reason why we should be eating raw foods over cooked foods. So, and I should tell you, before I get to this, I want to tell you, this was the most difficult question that we addressed in this book, in Becoming Raw. It was very, very difficult to get answers, because there was nothing written about it in the scientific literature that was really obvious. We had to search and search. And in fact, what we did was a lot of the raw food gurus would quote enzyme researchers like Michael Gardner from the UK and Stephen Rothman from the United States, and they would say that according to the work of this researcher, enzymes do such and such and are, extremely important. Their research proves how important enzymes are. So what did we do? We took their quotes and went to the original researchers. We talked to Michael Gardner in the UK, and we talked to Stephen Rothman in the United States, and we said, are they interpreting your work correctly? Does your work prove this? And I can tell you, in every case, they said, where in the heck did they get that from? Seriously, they were absolutely stunned. They said, my work doesn't show anything of the sort. My work isn't even really about that. And so that was the kind of searching we were doing. So why do plants have enzymes? What's the purpose of enzymes in plants? Well, plants actually have enzymes to help them harvest the energy from the sun, to break down the storage forms of protein and carbohydrates and fats in the seeds so that they can be used for the growth of the new plant. They're there to catalyze multiple reactions necessary for the protection and survival of the plant. So are plant enzymes helpful for people too? The answer is yes, they're probably helpful, and no, they're probably not necessary. Okay, and let me explain that. There are two ways that enzymes from plants can actually be helpful to us. Number one is they contain certain phytochemicals they convert certain phytochemicals into their bioactive metabolites. So there's a couple of enzymes in plants that the enzymes help to convert to the active forms. Second, they can aid in the digestive process. A little bit, probably not much. So let's look at the first one. There are actually two enzymes that we know of. There may be others, but there are two that we specifically know of that convert phytochemicals into their active forms. The first is myrosinase, which is in cruciferous vegetables like cabbage and broccoli and cauliflower and kale. And the second is alliinase in allium vegetables like garlic and onions. So myrosinase, the job myrosinase does is to convert a phytochemical called glucosinolates into their active forms, which are a number of different kinds of isothiocyanates. And basically, isothiocyanates, you may have heard of some of them. Have you ever heard of sulforaphane? Sulforaphane in broccoli sprouts. Well, these things are very highly prized for their ability to induce phase 2 enzymes. What are phase 2 enzymes? They're the enzymes that when you consume or are exposed to toxins, they actually help to attach a water-soluble compound to the toxin so that your body can flush it out in your urine or your bile. Okay, so very, very important. They also kill cancer cells. They reduce cell proliferation. So very, very important. If you think about it, phytochemicals are higher in young plants because why are phytochemicals in plants? To help the plants survive. They're like the army of protectors for the plants. So a young little baby plant's going to need more. So if you compare the sulforaphane in broccoli to the sulforaphane in broccoli sprouts, there are probably 30 to 100 times more in the broccoli sprouts than the broccoli. You would get as much from an ounce of broccoli sprouts as you would from 2 pounds of broccoli. Okay? So, and I have to say, with this stuff, if you cook the broccoli, this enzyme will be destroyed because cooking destroys the enzyme. Therefore, you won't get as much conversion to that bioactive form. Now, it's not like you put the broccoli in boiling water and all the myrosinase is gone. That's not how it works. It's a gradual reduction of myrosinase. Okay, now if you chop up the broccoli really fine, you will activate the myrosinase and some conversion will start right there. So there's a number of things that can affect the myrosinase content. But cooking does reduce or eliminate myrosinase. So allanase is the enzyme in garlic and onions that converts allicin to the bioactive form allicin. Allicin has antimicrobial, antifungal, antibacterial, lipid-lowering, anti-arthritic, anti-cancer activities. So again, very, very helpful compound. So, and again, if you, let's see, go back there. If you chop up your garlic and let it sit for 10 minutes before throwing it into your soup, you'll actually get some conversion from allicin to allicin. And so you're getting the bioactive form. So that's another way that you can improve the conversion. And then cooking, well, you've already got that conversion has happened. So the cooking's not going to destroy the allicin. It's only going to destroy the allanase. Okay? So what about food enzymes in the digestive process? Well, food enzymes can actually have some function to break down. See, remember what food enzymes are in plants for. They help to break down the storage form of nutrients so that the plants can use them. Well, they will do that on an ongoing basis. For example, with a banana, as it gets riper and riper, you're getting enzyme action to break down the starches into sugars so they're more available for use. And so even when we chew, when we chop things up, we get that action going. Now this part most people have not heard before, but our food actually sits in this holding tank in the top part of our stomach for 20 to 60 minutes. This was interesting research, and again, we talked directly to the researchers so we would get it just right. But 20 to 60 minutes, while it's being held, the pH is 4.5 to 5.8 in that part of the stomach. Shocking, actually. That's the exact pH needed for the functioning of enzymes. That is best for enzyme work. However, when the food drops to the lower part of the stomach, the pH goes down to 1.3 to 2.5, and the enzymes are pretty much destroyed. They are broken down into amino acids. In the small intestine, actually some enzymes get through to the small intestine. This doesn't happen often. It happens most commonly when the enzymes are attached to or combined with some sort of viable microorganism, as in a fermented or a cultured food. Okay, so we'll get a little bit more survival into the small intestine. So what does that mean? How much would this contribute to digestion? Well, in fact, evidence suggests that it contributes very little. And there's very few studies on this. But it's interesting, if you look at the amylase, for example, in fresh carrot juice, this is the enzyme that breaks down a starch called amylose. Okay? If you look at that, you will see about 20 to 30 units per liter in carrot juice. There are about 200,000 units per liter in unstimulated saliva. That's saliva when we haven't even been eating. It's much higher in stimulated saliva. So just no comparison. And guess what? Most of our digestion does not occur in the mouth. It occurs in the small intestine. Okay, that's where most of it occurs. And so our bodies are highly dependent on the enzymes that we produce that are put into the small intestine to break down foods. So even though food enzymes may have a small impact, it really is very, very small. So the take-home message here is food enzymes are of probably greater value than is commonly recognized within mainstream medical or scientific circles. And while food enzymes may not play a huge role in digestion, we're just starting to learn about other roles they may have, like converting phytochemicals into their active forms. So raw belief number 2, cooked foods are toxic. Have you heard that one before? Shouldn't eat them because they're toxic. And so what does science say about this? Well, cooking doesn't turn foods into toxins. Cooking is safe. However, there may be some byproducts formed with high temperature cooking that are carcinogenic, and we'll talk about those. Wet cooking methods are the safest. Okay, so if you cook food with some moisture, so you're making a soup or a stew, or you're steaming or boiling, this actually minimizes nutrient losses, and also it helps to minimize the formation of byproducts. Cooking actually, in some cases, can enhance nutrient bioavailability. And this is especially true for legumes. It's especially true for any food that has a lot of anti-nutrients. Cooking will break them down, and it also breaks down cell walls, so it makes the absorption of some nutrients easier. So what are the problems with cooking then? Well, the potential problems with cooking are, first of all, cooking can reduce nutrient and phytochemical intakes. It can damage nutrients. It can produce potentially harmful byproducts. However, the method of cooking and the length of cooking time dramatically affects any damage or loss to the food. So what about the minerals and the vitamins? Well, first of all, minerals, boiling will probably cause a loss of about 30 to 40% at most. And what happens? The minerals go into the water. So if you're making soup or stew, it's no big deal. You're eating the liquid, right? So it's only if you pour the water off, you'll lose some minerals. But you cannot destroy minerals with heat. It doesn't affect the minerals at all. As a matter of fact, if you burn something to a crisp and all you've got left is ashes, guess what those ashes are? Minerals. Okay, so you're not destroying minerals by cooking. What about vitamins? Well, they're more prone to losses than are minerals. And in fact, commercial food processing, so say canning or something like that, can lead to losses of about 50 to 80%. Boiling, same thing. If you're getting rid of the water, you're losing about 50 to 80% of the nutrients. And steaming or brief cooking, maybe 20, 30% at most. And that's it. So what about phytochemicals? Again, you can lose phytochemicals with cooking. And cooking can reduce a number of phytochemicals, but the losses are accelerated, again, by higher temperatures and by dry cooking. Carotenoids are the main exception to that rule. We actually enhance the availability of carotenoids when we cook carrots and squash and other carotenoid-rich foods because it helps to break down the plant cell walls, and it just makes it more available for us. However, this is interesting. There have actually been 3 studies, to my knowledge, that have looked at cooked carrots versus juiced carrots, for example. And you actually absorb more carotenoids from the juice than you do from the cooked carrots. You absorb more from the juice than you would from raw carrots or cooked carrots. And that's because the juicing actually completely gets rid of the plant cell walls. That's what's being held back. So the bioavailability becomes higher. So what about the potentially harmful byproducts? And first of all, they are heterocyclic amines, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, advanced glycation end products, and acrylamide. And these are not all, there are many others, but these are the ones that we'll focus on today. So what are heterocyclic amines? Well, heterocyclic amines are chemicals that are formed when meat, fish, poultry, or eggs are subjected to very high temperatures. And the reason why there's none of this stuff that forms in plants is because of the need for creatine or creatinine in meat to form heterocyclic amines. So basically, it's sort of this creatine or creatinine combines with free amino acids and sugars to create this compound. And in 2005, the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, added this compound to the list of cancer-causing agents. And it has been linked to colorectal cancer, to stomach cancer, to pancreatic cancer, and to breast cancer. Vegans don't have to worry. This isn't something we have to worry about because we don't get any. But we do get polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. And these compounds are chemicals that are formed by the incomplete burning of carbon-containing substances, foods, fats, whatever, anything cooked above 392 degrees. It's present in grilled or charred meats, but it's also present in any plant foods that are charred at that temperature. So these are known mutagens. They damage DNA, they produce lung, skin, genitourinary cancers, and are a big concern. So we obviously want to minimize our intakes of those things. Then we've heard a little bit about advanced glycation end products already, and these are the irreversible end products of the Maillard reaction. Remember the stuff that browns bread and so forth? The most concentrated sources are grilled and fried meats, although browning of any foods can cause the formation of HEEs. And these things are concerned because they have been linked to pretty much every disease process you can think of. So how much of these things do we find in food? I just wanted to show you this so you'd get a little bit of an idea. So the first thing is broiled frankfurters, over 10,000 units in 3-ounce serving. If you boil it, less so, but grilled or fried meat, then butter, but look at this, grilled or fried tofu as well. So it depends on the amount of browning that occurs. And then if you look down, the snack foods and the fruits and vegetables, of course, being much, much lower sources. What about acrylamide? This is a product that vegetarians have to worry a little bit more about. Acrylamide actually forms when high carbohydrate foods are heated above 248 degrees. We almost always heat foods above 248 degrees, but they can even be formed at temperatures as low as 149, for example, with dehydration of foods. So this compound develops when the amino acid asparagine reacts with the naturally occurring sugars in foods, such as glucose. And it occurs during the latter stages of baking, roasting, or frying. The most concentrated sources are potato products, actually, because potatoes are particularly high in asparagine. So does it mean that we shouldn't eat potatoes? Of course not. But it's just something to be aware of. If you're deep frying, for example, you get a lot more of this compound forming. So you're much better off to steam or boil or even bake than you would be to be frying foods. And this compound has been classified as a probable carcinogen. This is shocking, so just be forewarned. These foods are showing the amount of acrylamide in 100 grams of the food. So for people that consume what do we call grain coffees or coffee substitutes, It's at the very top of the list, because what are grain substitutes? They're blackened barley, blackened grains. So they're very high, but you don't eat 100 grams of them. You eat 5 grams, a teaspoon. So it's not quite as big of a deal. But then look at sweet potato chips, regular potato chips, rye crisp bread. Everybody thinks it's the biggest health food going. It is fairly high in acrylamide. French fries, coffee, ready-to-eat cereals, and nuts and nut butters that have been roasted, almonds in particular, if we roast them and they turn brown inside, there's a fair bit of acrylamide formed, and bread is lower in the compounds that are necessary to form this stuff. So the take-home message here is, while cooking does not turn foods into poison, some methods of cooking can produce byproducts that are toxic to human health. And so we want to carefully choose our cooking methods. Raw food preparation methods like soaking, sprouting, fermenting result in significant improvements in the nutritional value of food, and they don't produce any of these compounds, or rarely produce any of these compounds. So the kind of bottom line there is that we actually have some things that we can learn from people who are experts in raw food preparations, because some of their techniques are really valuable and very, very healthy. So the third is we get plenty of B12 from plant foods and internal production. And there are several of the raw food gurus who absolutely swear we do not need to take B12 if we eat properly. So if you eat a mono diet, or you eat, just a certain kind of raw diet, you will produce plenty in your system. You don't need to take a B12 supplement. And while it's possible you could get enough, it is very highly unlikely. In fact, there have been, not a lot, but there have been a number of studies looking at the B12 status of raw food eaters. There were 5 studies, 3 done in Europe, 2 done in the United States. And in every case, this is consistent across the board, the vast majority of participants in those studies who were not taking B12 supplements were B12 deficient, period. Their levels were dismal, and their homocysteine was through the roof. Okay, this is not a good thing. This is what we call shooting ourselves in the foot. Okay, because when we blow B12, we lose our health. And we're telling everybody around us that they're justified in eating meat. Because they'll be as sick as we are. So this is something I feel very, very strongly about. People, the average B12s in these people that were studied, 100 to 200 picograms per mil. Serum B12, it should be over 400. Okay, so in my view. Plant foods are rarely good sources of vitamin B12. There are 3 sources that people often claim to be good B12 sources. Number 1, seaweed. And this is the one that raw foodists often use as their primary source of B12. The problem is that seaweeds do contain some usable true B12, but they also contain what we call B12, inactive B12 analogs. So they actually look like B12. They attach to B12 receptor sites, but they don't do the job B12 does. So guess what? They contribute to a functional B12 deficiency in the process. So this is not a good thing. Now and when you dry seaweed, you actually produce more of these inactive analogs. So really, really important that we make sure that we're getting a source. Now there are 2 possible exceptions here. One is chlorella, and the other is this blue-green algae called AFA. They may contain usable B12 and may be reasonably reliable sources. However, we don't really have enough studies to say, yeah, go ahead and do it. We've got 1 study from the UK, I think, on 1 person, and we've got a lady in Italy that we've been communicating with that has done a few studies, but she used massive amounts of this stuff, like 6 pills a day. Some people didn't respond, so they're just not reliable sources. Then we've got fermented fermented foods. Well, fermented foods, actually, this is interesting. It really depends on how sanitary your conditions are when you ferment foods. So, for example, on Friday, Dr. Susianto shared his research on tempeh as a source of B12 in Indonesia, and it happens to be an excellent source of B12 in Indonesia. It also happens not to be as reliable a source in the United States because we use stainless steel, sanitary vats, and so we don't get as much B12 because of the way we're producing it. Organic vegetables, well, if they were grown on human manure or something that had a lot of B12 producing microorganisms, they might be sources if we ate them while they were still dirty. But we might also get some pathogenic bacteria in the process, like E. coli, which we're trying to avoid. So, these are not reliable sources of vitamin B12. Internal production is not enough. B12 production occurs mainly in the large intestine. Things usually don't go backwards. We absorb it in the small intestine, and like I say, things don't go backwards. So, some of the raw foodists are saying you can get enough from production in your mouth and in your small intestine. You don't get enough from production in your small intestine. That's not where the bacteria live that produce this stuff. They live in the large intestine. So what about the mouth? Well, if you have very, very poor oral hygiene, and you have a lot of plaque around your teeth, which I know some raw foodists who have tried this trick, they lost all their friends. However, they probably were making some B12 in their mouths. Not a good plan. There is a genius from Germany, right over here, who has thought of a much, much better way to put B12 in our mouths, and that is with toothpaste. And Sebastian, this is just genius. I think this was absolutely brilliant. So we may be seeing it over here in the years to come. They're checking into that, but it's available in Europe now, this toothpaste, and it works. They've tested it, and the absorption is great. So another much more friendly, socially friendly way of getting our B12. So what about B12 stores? Some people say, we don't have to worry about it. We've got stores that'll last us 20 years. Well, in fact, B12 is very efficiently recycled. That's true. Stores might last 2 years. They might last 3 years in most people without any obvious dietary source. However, some people become deficient within 5 or 6 months. And this is not a good thing. Breastfed babies born to B12 deficient mothers can develop signs of clinical deficiency within weeks of birth, and within months of birth, they can have irreversible brain damage. Okay, this is not a good thing. We need to be responsible about our choices, and we need to make sure that our children are very, very well nourished. So what does B12 deficiency look like? Well, we get the same kind of symptoms as we would from iron deficiency. We get an anemia called megaloblastic anemia, which causes weakness and fatigue and irritability, depression. We get nerve damage, and one of the very first symptoms we have is numbness and tingling in our extremities, okay? And difficulty with balance and walking, memory loss, confusion. We get GI disturbances like indigestion, diarrhea, sore tongue, reduced appetite, and we get elevated homocysteine. This is what we do not want to happen, because when homocysteine gets elevated, it messes up our brain. Okay, so it increases our risk for Alzheimer's, it increases our risk for cardiovascular disease, it increases our risk for birth defects, it increases risk for premature death. So that is what we must not do. So what are reliable sources? Well, for vegetarians, fortified foods like ready-to-eat cereals, non-dairy beverages, veggie meats, all of these kinds of things are sources. The B12 fortified toothpaste, which we hope we see here, and then, of course, supplements. How much do we need? We need about 4 micrograms a day from fortified foods in 2 or more meals. Okay? We need about 25 to 100 micrograms a day from a supplement like a multivite if we're doing it daily. If we're doing it just once or twice a week, we need more. So if you're doing it twice a week, you need about 1,000 micrograms. Why so much? The recommended intake is 2.4 micrograms. Why would we have to do 1,000? Because we only absorb about 0.5%, maybe 1% if we're lucky, when we consume anything over about 500 micrograms. So the take-home message here is don't mess with B12. Plant foods are not reliable sources. You need to know your B12 status, and you need to ensure a reliable source. So raw belief number 4, legumes contain anti-nutrients that are best completely avoided. And I don't know if you've ever heard this, but you might have noticed that raw foodists don't consume legumes often. They just leave them out of their diet completely. So all plant foods contain anti-nutrients. Why? Well, I'll explain that in a second. But basically, legumes contain 2 anti-nutrients that are especially problematic. One is called hemagglutinins and the other is trypsin inhibitors. You need to understand why anti-nutrients are in plants. Anti-nutrients are substances that are there to protect the plants. They are basically making sure that the food that is stored within that little seed is preserved until it's needed for plant growth. Okay, so they're there to protect the plant from predators and to make sure that those foods can't be easily accessed. So that's why anti-nutrients are there. When the seed is germinated, these anti-nutrients are broken down by enzymes so that the plant can use these stored forms of energy. Anti-nutrients can also be broken down when we soak, when we ferment, and when we cook foods. All of those things can reduce anti-nutrients. And it's interesting, the problem with anti-nutrients is that they can interfere with the absorption of things that are very valuable, like iron and zinc, phytates, oxalates. These are anti-nutrients. So it's important that we don't overconsume them, but most people can handle a reasonable level of anti-nutrients without compromising their nutritional status. And in fact, we have recently learned, or reasonably recently learned, that antioxidants are not, or anti-nutrients are not all bad. Many anti-nutrients actually have anti-pathogenic properties, which means that they can have anti-cancer, antiviral, anti-cardiovascular disease, antifungal, anti-inflammatory properties. And so, in fact, having some of these in our diets may actually be protective. So let's talk briefly about hemagglutinins. Hemagglutinins are proteins that bind to sugar molecules. When consumed, they cause red blood cells to clump together, increasing cell division and interfering with nutrient transport. The most concentrated sources are uncooked or undercooked kidney beans or small red beans. And if you consume kidney beans or small red beans that are not properly cooked, so say you've cooked them on a low in your crock pot, for example, for an insufficient amount of time, you will feel like you are going to die. Seriously, this is not good news. It is absolutely debilitating, vomiting, diarrhea. It is, you just really wish, you would just wish to be in a coma. So it's not good. So this stuff is not good. We want to get rid of it. However, we can get rid of it simply by cooking. So for example, if you want to cook kidney beans in your crock pot, boil them for a half an hour first. Okay, that's all you have to do. Half an hour or an hour, and the hemagglutinins are pretty much gone. And then you can put them in your crock pot. Germination can reduce hemagglutinins by 75 to 100%. However, I don't recommend germinating red kidney beans. Okay? You don't want to do that because there's still enough there to make you very sick. Lentils and peas contain hemagglutinins, but they're not as toxic as the ones found in the red beans. Okay, so you probably don't have to worry as much about those. You can sprout them without any problem. The bottom line is most of the bigger legumes need to be cooked. Okay, you can sprout them, just cook them after you've sprouted them. And to be honest with you, when you sprout, like sometimes when I'm most people are worried about eating a lot of legumes because they cause gas, right? Well, guess what happens when you germinate and sprout the legumes? The oligosaccharides that cause the problems get broken down into more simple sugars, so they're much more digestible. So if you sprout your legumes for a couple of days, which means soaking them for a day and then sprouting them for a day or two, it will actually reduce their gassiness. Okay, so that's not a bad idea. So what about trypsin inhibitors? Well, trypsin is an enzyme that our bodies produce to help us break proteins into their component parts, which are amino acids, right? So that we can absorb them into our bloodstream. Well, trypsin inhibitors are things that actually block the action of trypsin. So then the trypsin can't work to break down our protein. So guess what? We're not able to absorb those amino acids that we need. So trypsin inhibitors, the most concentrated source is soybeans. Soybeans contain a lot of trypsin inhibitors. There's several different types of trypsin inhibitors, actually. Amounts in other legumes are only about 15 to 40% that of soybeans. Peas are low in trypsin inhibitors. They only contain about 2 to 13% that of soybeans. And chickpeas contain about 66% that of soybeans, and lima beans about 77%. So they are actually fairly high in trypsin inhibitors. So when trypsin inhibitors block the action of trypsin, the pancreas is stimulated to produce more trypsin, right? Because we need more. This can actually drain the body's supply of sulfur-containing amino acids because we're having to produce so much that are used in sulfur-containing amino acids are used in making trypsin. Legumes are already low in sulfur-containing amino acids. They're higher in grains, okay? They're lower in legumes. And so if you're eating a lot of foods containing trypsin inhibitors, it can actually compromise your protein nutrition, especially if you're eating barely enough protein. And I have to tell you, when we were analyzing raw food diets for nutrient content, protein was an issue. It's not usually an issue in conventional vegan diets because we eat beans, right? But in the raw food diets, it was more of an issue, and intakes were often very marginal. And in the diets that were really high in fat and really high in fruit, it was hard to meet protein requirements. So if you have those kinds of diets and you're eating a lot of trypsin inhibitors on top of it, then it can be a real problem. So what can we do to reduce trypsin inhibitors? Well, germinating reduces trypsin inhibitors, and fermenting reduces trypsin inhibitors. Actually, it takes about 13 days of germination to completely eliminate trypsin inhibitors from soy, and we don't sprout them for that long. But boiling pretty much eliminates trypsin inhibitors. 80 to 100% are gone. So cooking is the most effective way of reducing trypsin inhibitors. Soaking reduces by 10 to 20%, fermenting by 38 to 100%, and germinating by 15 to 65%. So just to give you an idea. So if you ate 100 grams of raw soybeans, it would eliminate your trypsin for an entire day. Not a good thing, but nobody eats raw soybeans, right? They're cooked before we eat them. But what about the legumes that are sprouted? Well, if you sprout 1 cup of chickpeas to make a raw hummus, for example, you will reduce your trypsin by about 21%. That's a lot. Not nearly so much with sprouted lentils, about 6%, mung beans, about 5%. So the bottom line here is, I think lentils and mung beans and peas are safe to sprout. Chickpeas, if you're using them occasionally, not a big deal, but generally the big beans need to be cooked. Legumes are nutritional powerhouses for people eating plant-based diets. They are a phenomenal source of protein, iron, zinc, vitamins, fiber, you name it. They're wonderful foods. So eliminating them, I don't think is a good plan. So I think for people that are eating raw food diets, the best idea is to eat, if they're eating 75% raw, to make that other 25% cooked legumes, steamed yams, things like that, to help increase the energy and nutrient content of the diet. So finally, raw belief number 5, raw food diets reverse chronic disease. Well, plant-based diets reverse chronic disease, whether they're raw or not. We know we have a lot of evidence to show they reverse coronary artery disease, and we now are getting a lot of evidence to suggest that they can also reverse diabetes. I actually had a client, and I won't tell you where, but I had a client recently who had a very serious diagnosis, a cancer diagnosis, that did not seem very treatable, and he decided to adopt a high raw diet, and I was supporting him in this, and along with another colleague. And the interesting thing is his family decided to do this with him. And his father, who was diabetic, decided to do this with him as well, not thinking that it would help anything, just wanting to support their son who was going through a very difficult time. Well, the good news is that the young man with cancer is in complete remission, and his father, who was on 35 units of insulin a day and 17 pills a day, is now on 0 insulin and 0 pills. Okay, so we know. Thank you. We know that this works. We've got plenty of evidence. So, but which is more powerful, a raw diet or a conventional diet? Well, it all depends on the design of the diet. There are good and bad conventional vegan diets, and there are good and bad raw diets. And so, the raw diet may be more effective than the conventional diet if it's well designed, but if it's not, the conventional diet will do a much better job. The two most damaging categories of food are animal products and processed foods. We know that. The thing about raw food diets is they have the advantage of pretty much eliminating or largely eliminating processed foods as well as the animal foods. Conventional vegan diets don't always do that, as you notice. So this is one of the potential advantages. So let me just tell you briefly about the evidence we have. We don't have a lot. We have direct evidence for rheumatoid arthritis, fibromyalgia, and overweight. Not a lot for overweight. We have limited evidence for and suggestive evidence for cancer, heart disease, and diabetes. So quickly, rheumatoid arthritis, we have 7 studies, all of them from Finland, and all using raw food, living raw food diets. And in every case, every single one of these studies showed very significant reductions in things like morning stiffness and swelling of the joints and other indicators of rheumatoid arthritis. We had modest benefits in the lab markers of rheumatoid arthritis. But interestingly, very favorable changes in fecal flora, blood cholesterol levels, and antioxidant status in the raw foodists. The benefits disappeared almost immediately when they reverted back to an omnivorous diet. So that's interesting. With fibromyalgia, we have 2 research groups, one in the US and one in Finland. And the US, it was Hallelujah Acres, if you're familiar with them. 20 patients followed for 7 months. 75% had significant improvement in their symptoms. The responders averaged a 46% reduction in symptoms. And in Finland, 28 patients were followed for 3 months, living food versus a control group, and the living food group had much better results than the control group, as you can imagine, reduced pain scores, morning stiffness, etc. And again, the symptoms return as soon as they went back to an omnivorous diet. Now, I don't have the references listed here because it just made the slides too messy, but all of these references, about 1,000 references in Becoming Raw, they're all there. So why would we have an advantage with a raw diet? Well, raw diets are very high in anti-inflammatory and antioxidant compounds. Some foods associated with allergies and with sensitivities, like dairy products and gluten, for example, are basically eliminated, so that can help. And the changes in microflora can go a long ways towards helping. That's a long story, so I won't go into it. And of course, the diets produce weight loss. And when you have arthritis or fibromyalgia, weight loss is usually a very good thing. So overweight and obesity, we don't have a lot. We have about 6 studies showing weight loss and average weight loss of about 9% in people following a raw food diet. Why would raw food diets produce weight loss? Well, on average, people eat 1,700 calories a day on a raw diet. So that's less than most people. It's less than what most people need, thus they lose weight. And raw staples, of course, are generally not very calorically dense. A lot of fruits and vegetables, so you can eat a large volume without getting too many calories. So what about cancer? We have 3 studies, and basically we don't have studies. You can't ethically take a group of cancer patients and say, okay, this half is going to have a raw diet, and this half is going to go through chemo and radiation therapy. You can't do that. So basically, we have studies that have just looked at metabolic markers of cancer. And in fact, they've shown very, very good changes in metabolic markers on raw diets versus omnivorous diets. Raw food vegans have less damage to their DNA, better protection against DNA damage, lower IGF-1 levels, and reduced levels of a variety of toxic metabolites. So do cooked vegans, if we want to call conventional vegans. But the raw vegans seem to have a little bit of an edge. And this is really interesting. Have you ever seen those books, Diet, Nutrition, and the Prevention of Cancer? They're like 700 pages or 600 pages, 60 countries from around the world with experts looking at the link between diet and cancer. Well, the fellow that was the chair of the first book done by the World, it was basically the World Cancer Research Institute and the American Institute of Cancer Research, that put these books out. And the first one, the chair of the whole committee was Dr. John Potter from the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center in Seattle. And he's definitely a pro-plant-based diet kind of guy, but he did research looking at, actually a review study looking at raw versus cooked vegetables. And what they found in over 24 studies is that both cooked vegetables and raw vegetables reduce cancer risk, but that raw foods tended to have more consistent reductions than the cooked vegetables. There was something in the raw vegetables that seemed to do an even better job. The authors suggested 4 reasons why the raw foods may be even better than the cooked vegetables. And they are, number 1, cooking decreases protective nutrients like vitamin C and phytochemicals. So there's more of those things in the raw foods. Number 2, cooking disables 2 enzymes. You know what they are, myrosinase and alanase, that produce anti-cancer compounds. So that would have an impact. Cooking changes the physical structure of food. It may actually decrease the insoluble fiber and that binds and carries away carcinogens. And finally, the cooking produces substances that can damage DNA. So we know what those are: acrylamide, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, advanced glycation end products. And cardiovascular disease, we have tremendous evidence that plant-based diets are effective in the prevention and treatment of cardiovascular disease. Very, very limited evidence for raw food diets. There are studies from the US and Europe that have shown improved metabolic markers of cardiovascular disease. So, for example, the United States, this is Fontana's study. He's done a number of studies comparing raw food eaters with Western food eaters, with finally the athletes. Okay, so 3 groups. And what he found was that the raw food eaters had the best results of all, which isn't a big surprise. They had lower blood pressure, lower LDL, lower triglycerides, lower HSCRP, which is a measure of inflammation, lower carotid artery IMT, which is a measure of the thickness of the blood vessel walls. So they just did better. And the studies from Finland and Germany found reduced cholesterol and triglyceride levels in raw food eaters, even in raw food eaters that were eating a little bit more fat than we would traditionally eat on a conventional diet. However, the effects of the raw food diet were undermined when there was a lack of 3 nutrients: vitamin B12, vitamin D, and omega-3 fatty acids, all of which are necessary for optimal cardiovascular health. So diabetes, plant-based diets have proven very protective, although we don't have any studies published on raw food diets. And just to tell you, the studies that we're doing in the Marshall Islands, these people, they have probably over 50% of the adults are diabetic in the Marshall Islands, okay? So just unbelievable. Probably 90% have either diabetes or pre-diabetes. 60 years ago, there was 0 diabetes in the Marshall Islands. What happened? Well, they went from living off the land and eating plants and fish to living off packaged foods like white rice and Spam. That's pretty much what they did. And washing it down with high fructose corn syrup. Beverages, seriously. That's their diet. The kids for breakfast eat ramen noodles with Kool-Aid powder sprinkled on top. I'm not kidding you, so it's bad news. So is my time completely up? Pretty much. Okay, I'll finish up in 1 minute. So we might have heard of Gabriel Cousens' work, and he makes some pretty amazing claims about what he can do with a raw food diet and diabetes, but he's never published any of the work. So why the advantage? Raw food diets have a very low glycemic load. I think that's and it's fruits and vegetables, so that covers that. Take-home message here is well-planned vegan and raw vegan diets have tremendous potential for the treatment of chronic diseases. And to maximize protection, we've got to get the nutrients we need, and we need to minimize the concentrated oils and sugars, which raw food people use as well. So how raw do we need to be to enjoy the advantages of raw food diets? We don't know. We really don't know. Although I think most people would be well advised to increase their intake of raw food a little bit. To include some raw foods in their diet every day. However, including some cooked foods can boost nutrition and variety and flexibility and social acceptance of a raw food diet. So a word of caution, I don't think 100% raw diets are very safe for children, and they have a greater potential for nutritional shortfalls. So, I think people should consider becoming raw food enthusiasts and learn from what the raw food community has figured out. They've learned a lot, and even if you don't become a raw foodist. Okay, so here's my, because I was asked to do my fitness thing very quickly. This is me, by the way. At 53 years of age. So I'm still fit, and I do exercise every day. Monday, I do a step or a box class, 50 minutes, then a weight class, 50 minutes. Tuesdays, yoga and boot camp. And boot camp, oh, it is a tough boot camp. The guy has this mohawk hairdo, and he's got muscles that he can barely put his arms down. They kind of go like this, and he's tough. So it's a good class. Wednesdays I do spin and Bosu. Thursdays I do yoga and boot camp. Fridays I go for a run and do a few weights. Saturday I do TRX or Zumba, and Sunday I do outdoor activities, biking, running, hiking, whatever. Physical activity is part of my life, and it's a priority in my life because why? Because we are the example for everyone around us. When people look at us, you are representing vegan in their eyes. For a lot of people, you're the only vegan they've ever met. You do well, and they get interested. It's your perfect opportunity to prove that not only is this not deficient, this is the best way of eating. And you know what? I do this for probably the same reason a lot of you do this, because I want to see this world be a more compassionate place. And I really appreciated Dr. McDougall's, inclusion of this topic. It's so important. In order to accomplish that, we are on trial in the eyes of the world. We really and truly are. We need to prove beyond any shadow of a doubt that this diet is safe and adequate. And we can do that with our example. Thank you very much.